"You're not on the list." The young soldier's voice rang out, cold, as if the old man standing at the gates of Arlington Cemetery were nothing more than a shadow. But he did not argue, nor did he turn away. He simply stood there, wearing his old military uniform, his hand gripping tightly a piece of cloth embroidered with the name Eleanor, the only thing left of his late wife. No one knew he had once been a Navy SEAL. No one knew he had come here to keep a promise made to the friend who saved his life on Iraqi soil. "Don't let them bury me alone." And he had not forgotten. Even if no one welcomed him, Bob Hawk Hawkins had once been a Navy SEAL. Amphibious landings, fighting in the dark, surviving in places no one else wanted to be. But this morning, he was nothing more than a shadow standing before the gates of Arlington Cemetery. No invitation, no name on any list. No one recognized him. Just an old man in a worn coat, his left leg made of metal, his shoes faded, a roughly embroidered patch slung over his shoulder. People looked at him the way one looks at a fragment of the past best forgotten. A few young soldiers passed by, glancing at him before turning away with a curl of the lip tinged with mild irritation. One of them muttered, "Probably lost." But Bob wasn't lost. He had come early, to the right place, on the right day. And he knew exactly who lay in that flag-draped coffin beyond the row of oak trees. The patch on his shoulder was perhaps the only thing still bearing Eleanor's touch, his wife who had died of cancer many years before. She had stitched her name into it while Bob was still in the hospital, wrestling with the pain from a failed mission in Kandahar. He had never taken it off. Not because it was a keepsake, but because it was the one thing that kept him connected to a part of his former self, the part that was decent, the part that still believed in loyalty. Bob drifted around D.C., sometimes near the Potomac, sometimes sleeping on stone benches by the Lincoln Memorial. He never begged for money. He only needed silence, and when necessary to appear, like this morning. Because the man being honored today, Admiral John Ace Raines, was not just a superior officer. He was the man Bob had dragged out from the rubble in Fallujah when their unit was ambushed. A pull at the very last second. A sentence spoken at just the right time. "If I die, don't let me go alone." Bob had never forgotten. So, even without an invitation, even with no one remembering his name, he came. He stood there, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward, hand resting on his faded beret as if he were still part of the team. A black SUV rolled past, the guards checking IDs. Everyone walked by him as if he were invisible. A woman carrying flowers glanced at him, then quickened her pace. The young soldier at the gate didn't bother to ask. He just looked at Bob's clothes for a second, shook his head, and tapped the clipboard. "Sir, you're not on the list." Bob said nothing. He knew those words were coming, and he also knew it wasn't their fault. To the world, he was just an old man who had lost his way. But to the one lying in there, he was an unfulfilled promise. Have you ever met someone who seemed forgotten, yet was carrying a vow no one else dared to bear? Bob Hawkins never spoke to anyone about Fallujah, even though he could. He could tell you about that June night in 2004, when the darkness was so complete you couldn't see your own hand even if you held it right in front of your face. He could tell you about the roar of the machine guns on the other side of the wall, or the screams crackling through a radio with a severed signal. But he didn't. Because among the things he carried, there were some better left kept. The man lying in the coffin this morning, Admiral John Ace Raines, had back then been just a young commander, hot-tempered and stubborn, but with a knack for losing his bearings whenever the map was upside down. Bob used to joke that if it weren't for GPS, Ace might have plowed straight into Basra instead of landing in Fallujah. That night, Bob had pulled Ace out of a house that had just exploded. Ace's leg was broken in 3 places, his body covered in blood. Bob carried him across a backyard littered with debris, step by step, each breath ragged and short. By the time they reached shelter, Ace was still conscious. He clutched Bob's shirt and whispered, "If I die, don't let me go alone." It wasn't an order. It wasn't a final will. It was simply something a man says when standing on the razor's edge between life and death. But Bob heard it, and Bob kept that promise. He never asked for a single dime for it, never told the story to the press. When Ace was reassigned to Washington, promoted, became a strategic advisor to the National Security Council, and eventually admiral and commander of the Pacific Fleet, Bob quietly vanished from the radar. Not because he resented the glory, but because he knew some things, if you drag them into the light, lose the truth they carry. Bob got by on soup kitchens, a few coins from helping people haul goods at the flea market. He never begged. Once in a while, if someone asked about his prosthetic leg, he'd just shrug and say, "I tripped over a difference of opinion." Then he'd give a faint smile, as if even he thought the joke wasn't half bad. Many thought he was eccentric. An old homeless man carrying a tattered piece of cloth like a talisman, sitting alone in the National Mall, staring out at the Potomac as if waiting for someone from the past to return. But that piece of cloth, the one embroidered with the name Eleanor, wasn't a talisman. It was evidence. She had stitched it when Bob returned home in 2010. By then, he had lost a leg, suffered endless sleepless nights, and felt nearly numb to the world. Eleanor didn't say much. She simply placed the cloth on his shoulder and sewed each stitch in silence. Just 3 weeks later, she died of cancer. Bob hadn't been able to do anything except nod in the face of that loss. Since then, he kept the cloth the way someone keeps an old photograph in their wallet. No one else saw any value in it. But for Bob, it was the only thing left that tied him to the two people he had loved, a wife who had passed away and a comrade being buried this morning. The cloth wasn't sewn by machine. Its lines weren't straight, only wavering like a child's handwriting. Yet each stitch had a soul, and when Bob placed his hand on his shoulder, he felt he hadn't truly been forgotten. On freezing winter nights, Bob had nothing but a thin blanket and that piece of cloth. He would fold it carefully and tuck it neatly into his inner coat pocket. Even if no one asked, he always placed his hand over it before sleeping like a self-defense habit, a ritual of reassurance. Once, in the emergency room of a community hospital, a nurse took off his coat to check a wound. She picked up the cloth, ready to toss it into the bin with other worn items. Bob had snatched it back harder than he thought he still had strength for. Not because it was merely a keepsake, but because he feared losing the last thread still connecting him to an unbroken past. No one else understood, but Bob knew this. When you've lost everyone who once believed in you, the smallest things left become sacred. The gate guard might not understand. The young officers might not care. But Bob still stood there, because he knew not everyone needs to be mentioned to deserve being remembered. And maybe, if not today, then another day someone will look at that piece of cloth and ask, "Who is Eleanor?" Can you guess what will happen next? Relax for a moment, drop a 1 or say, "I'm still here" in the comments to keep listening. The funeral began right on time. As with everything in the military, no delay by a minute, no deviation by a step. Beneath the shade of Arlington's old oak trees, the white chairs were already filled. A neatly folded flag rested on the marble table, right beside the framed portrait of Admiral John Ace Rains, surrounded by white flowers. The honor guard marched out in perfect precision, as if even time itself had to slow down to give way to the ceremony. Bob Hawkins still stood outside the gate. He didn't step back, didn't move forward. The wind lightly lifted the hem of his worn coat, making the cloth embroidered with the name Eleanor drift gently from his frayed shoulder. People passed by him as if he were part of the fence, dark sunglasses, tailored suits, a few wary glances, but no one stopped. When the 3 volleys of the gun's salute rang out, Bob didn't flinch. He didn't need anyone to tell him how to stand at attention. His old shoes were aligned just as they had been in his service days. Hands clasped behind his back, one flesh, one metal, eyes fixed on the flag. And then, in the midst of that solemn funeral, something no one expected happened. A man stepped down from the honor platform. Not an aide, not a security officer. It was Admiral William McRaven, former commander of SEAL Team 6, the man who had given orders in operations no one was ever allowed to know about. He crossed through the rows of chairs, leaving behind a line of generals and dignitaries. No one dared call for him to stop. Bob didn't recognize him at first, not until McRaven stopped, just a few steps away. The crowd began to stir. Cameras swung toward the gate, but McRaven didn't care. He stood before Bob, eyes locked on him, as if searching for something from a long time ago, inside a frame long forgotten. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply gave a slight nod. In his hands was a polished wooden box, small, heavy, just the right size to hold with both hands. Then he handed it to Bob. No introduction, no formalities. Bob reached out to take it. One of his hands trembled not from weakness but from memory. In that moment, all of Arlington seemed to hold its breath. No one gave the order, but every eye turned toward the two men standing on the very edge of the ceremony. That box was not a token. It was what remained of John Ace Raines. His cremated remains, placed in the hands of the only man he had ever trusted to take him to his final resting place. There was no music, no applause, only the sound of the wind and the rustle of leaves. A silence so deep you could hear a heartbeat if you stood close enough. McRaven leaned in and whispered something into Bob's ear. No one else could hear, but Bob nodded. And for the first time that morning, he stepped through the iron gates. The young soldiers, the same ones who had mocked him earlier, now stood at attention. No one told them to. They simply stood, as if witnessing something their training manuals had never taught them. Bob walked slowly. Each step seemed heavier, yet more certain. In his hands was the box. On his shoulder was the vow. And within him was all that remained of a life lived for what was right. McRaven did not walk ahead, nor did he follow behind. He walked beside him. Those who were there that day would not tell the moment the same way. Some said they saw the admiral bow his head. Others swore Bob gave the faintest smile. But all remembered one thing. The silence at that moment was clearer than any speech could ever be. My dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a second to leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all over the world. Bob Hawkins entered the funeral without anyone inviting him. He was neither stopped nor guided to his place, yet no one was mistaken about why he was there. In his hands was the wooden box, heavier than any metal he had ever received. It was the final part of a man who had sworn never to leave a battlefield without a brother by his side. And this morning, that oath was kept not by those in fresh uniforms, but by a man in a worn coat and with a prosthetic leg, still bound by loyalty to what could never be replaced. There was no music as Bob walked down the aisle. No one gave a signal, yet the rows of guests along the path instinctively rose to their feet. Some placed their hands over their hearts. A few older men removed their hats. The eyes that had once looked at him coldly now held silent respect. A few younger ones glanced at each other, looking uneasy. They had seen him that morning, but they hadn't truly seen him. Bob walked slowly, partly because of his leg, partly because of the memories. Each step was a story, a comrade, someone who had fallen and never been brought home. And today he carried not only Ace but also all the others' names not etched in stone, yet never erased from memory. McRaven walked beside him, saying nothing. His posture was as straight as it had been in the service, but his eyes carried something no training manual could teach, knowing when to step back so another could step forward. When they reached the funeral table, Bob placed the box upon the draped flag. Not a sound. No photographer stepped forward. It seemed everyone understood this was not a moment to capture, but a moment to remember. He removed his hat, bowed his head slightly. His flesh and bone hand rested on the flag as if holding on to one final breath. No one applauded. No speeches were made. Yet the air was heavier than any flowery words. It thickened with silence. He was not there to tell a story. He was there to keep a promise. A young soldier, the same one who had laughed at him that morning, now stood at attention, his neck stiff with emotion. As Bob turned to walk away, the young man whispered something, too quiet for anyone else to hear. But Bob nodded, and that nod carried more weight than any apology. Bob walked back slowly, his legs no longer as steady as they once were, but his posture held, just as it always had, not for the audience, but because someone in his heart was still watching. At the end of the aisle he paused. His gaze lingered on the altar, where the flag now covered the box. He did not cry. A man like Bob had long grown accustomed to keeping everything inside his chest. But his eyes shone with something that could not be defined, something that made everyone present understand. Some people do not need to be named to be remembered. Beneath the trees, a little girl, the granddaughter of Admiral Rains, clutched her mother's hand. She turned to look at Bob and whispered, "Who is he?" Her mother bent down, her voice trembling, "The man who kept your grandfather's final promise." Bob did not hear those words, but as if sensing that gaze, he turned and gave a faint smile. Not the smile of pride, but of a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for far too long. One of the photographers who had been standing still all this time lowered his camera. He didn't take the shot, didn't record a thing. He just stood there, like an uninvited guest who had now witnessed something worth remembering for a lifetime. Someone from behind placed a gentle hand on Bob's shoulder. It was McRaven. That touch wasn't a signal. It was simply confirmation. You did right. We kept the promise. And that was enough to bring peace. As the band began the next ceremonial piece, Bob had already moved to the back row. He didn't sit, just stood. For the rest of the service, he remained there like a sentinel, as if the ceremony itself needed him to hold its silent moral weight in place. When it was over, as the chairs began to be cleared away and the flag was folded with solemn care, Bob still hadn't left. The sun was high now, its light casting his shadow long across the grass. A few people approached to shake his hand, saying nothing, only looking at him as though they had encountered something truly noble. Do you think a man not listed anywhere could be the only one carrying the most important thing of all? When the final notes of the bugle faded, the cemetery still did not stir. No one clapped, no one spoke, but those eyes remained fixed on a man standing motionless at the end of the last row. Bob Hawkins did not take another step. He stood there as if unwilling to break the moment that had just passed. A moment he had not created with words, nor with rank, but with presence alone. A presence that slowed everything down, that made things thought to be old feel new again. Honor, loyalty, promise. The first to approach was a young soldier, the same one who had thrown a mocking remark earlier that morning. He moved slowly, not meeting Bob's eyes until he was standing right beside him. There was no commander, no order given. Just a hand raised, not for a handshake, but for a salute. A proper, steady salute. He whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry, sir." Bob did not reply. He didn't need to. He simply nodded slowly, meaningfully, a nod that closed a chapter no one but him had ever read. Then came the veterans. They spoke little. A thin man leaning on his cane with his left hand raised his right hand in a salute and held it there for a long moment. Another, older than Bob, removed his camouflage cap, and placed his hand over his heart. No one explained who they were. They didn't have to. Those who had known the battlefield didn't need introductions. A woman standing near the exit also stepped forward. Her hair was silver, her shoulders draped in an old military coat. In her hands was a black and white photograph of a young man in a Marine uniform. She didn't ask if Bob had known him. She simply said softly, "Welcome home, warrior," then walked away, needing no reply. Others began to follow. No one told them to. No one led them. A group of young men stopped, removed their baseball caps, and bowed their heads. A cameraman switched off his gear, then stepped forward to offer his hand without saying a word. That gesture was not for the sake of going viral. It was for something he had just understood late, but not too late. A child, the same little girl from earlier, let go of her mother's hand, stepped toward Bob, and held out a wildflower. Bob accepted it, hesitating for a moment, then gently touched the girl's hair. It was the only moment his gaze softened like that, not because of the flower, but because he saw that the future still recognized the value of the past. The cameraman stood in silence. His camera was off, but he pulled out his phone. Not to film, but to take one final picture, a candid image with no one posing. Bob holding a flower, the wind tugging lightly at his coat, with rows of flags behind him and faces that had stopped smiling. Beginning to understand? A funeral staff member, someone who had followed protocol to the letter all morning, approached, looking slightly uneasy. He said something, then gestured toward an empty row of seats. Bob glanced that way but didn't move. McCraven, still standing nearby, spoke softly, and the staff member bowed his head and walked away. No one asked about the list anymore. As people began to disperse, Bob made his way toward a tree near the corner of the cemetery. An old oak, leaning from years of coastal wind. At its base, he sat down slowly, the prosthetic leg giving a faint metallic sound as it met the ground. From his coat pocket, he drew out an old piece of cloth, the one he had kept close to his chest throughout the ceremony. Slowly, he dug a small patch of earth and buried the cloth at the base of the tree. No ritual, no explanation, just one final act to leave a part of a memory here. From a distance, another veteran saw and gave a silent nod. A younger man beside him asked quietly, "What did he just do?" The veteran replied, "You'll understand when there's someone you once promised never to forget." No television station reported it. No golden plaque would mark it. But everyone present knew that a part of today's funeral, the deepest part, had not been in the official program. How many people do you think will remember a homeless old man? The answer? Those who witnessed him keep his promise. Afternoon light slipped through the branches like the hands of time, gently brushing over worn military shoulders and the rows of chairs now emptying. The crowd dispersed slowly, their footsteps striking the ground like the low drumbeat of an ending. But one man did not leave. Bob Hawkins still stood there, at the very end, not because he was held back, but because no one forced him to go. His shadow stretched long across the grass, not the image of a homeless man anymore, but that of a witness. A silent figure who had moved through the funeral not to attend it, but to fulfill something no one else could fully understand. He walked slowly toward the small pond behind the cemetery, where an old oak tree stood like another witness. It bore no bronze plaque, was not planted by decree. It had simply grown from the soil the way memories grow from the human heart. When he reached the shade of the tree, Bob stopped. The wind teased his silver hair, lifted his coat, then let it fall. His left hand reached into the inner pocket of his coat, the place where he had always kept an old piece of cloth. It wasn't an insignia, nor a medal. Just a coarse scrap, the stitching wavering, each letter trembling. Eleanor, the name of the wife whose hand he had held each night until that hand no longer held back. He sat down, not with difficulty, but slowly. Slowly, like someone writing the final bars of a symphony. With roughened fingers, he scraped a small patch of earth at the tree's base. No one witnessed it. No cameras recorded it. There was only an old man and a piece of cloth. He set it into the soil gently, as if afraid of hurting something softer than the earth itself. That piece of cloth, once buried, did not disappear. It dissolved into the soil, the way memory dissolves into the blood not seen, but never gone. Bob covered the earth again, patting the layer of soil as if soothing a sleep. Then he stood up. This time he didn't have to strain. His body was old, but his back was straight. There was no sorrow left, only peace. In the distance, a young couple stopped. They weren't sure why they had paused. They only knew that something about the man kept them from turning away. The wife squeezed her husband's hand and murmured, "Perhaps he isn't honored like the others, but I think he's the only one who never left the battlefield." At the exit, a young funeral staffer quietly removed the name badge from his chest. He turned back to look at the oak, then walked in another direction, not following the crowd. Something in him had just changed, a recognition without a name, needing no explanation. Late afternoon. The cemetery was quiet now. The flags no longer billowed. They let themselves drift softly in the day's last breeze. On the honor table, the wooden box still lay there, heavy not with substance but with memory. Someone silently set a single white chrysanthemum beside it. No brass plaque, no announcer. Just a chrysanthemum. McRaven returned backstage, not to the honor platform. He looked at no one, stopping only at the funeral register to handwrite a few lines. A moment later, an aide read them and fell silent. The words were not long. Not every hero is listed, but every vow that is kept must be remembered. BH. A few days later, beneath the oak where Bob had buried the cloth, a small bronze plaque was set into the ground. No pomp, no unveiling. Only a single line. Here rests a promise kept. Here rests a promise kept. People didn't come in crowds, but those who had heard the story made their way there. Some left a challenge coin, others pinned an old badge. A few veterans placed their hands on the bronze plaque and stood at attention. A young girl brought the first piece of embroidery she had ever made, folded it neatly, and laid it at the base of the tree. And one day, on the wall of a nearby bus stop where Bob had once sat through many windy nights, someone had written in chalk, "We know who you are, and we remember." The story had no grand ending. No frame of medals hung on television. But what remained was gratitude, not spoken aloud, but carried quietly in people's hearts. Bob never sought fame. He simply went where there was something right to be done. Yet it was precisely that which made him unforgettable. Do you remember the last time someone kept a promise to the very end? Bob Hawkins never forgot. And that is why he became the man who did not need to be honored yet will forever deserve to be remembered. Sometimes, those who remain silent carry the heaviest promises. Bob Hawkins never needed anyone to mention his name. All he needed was to keep a promise he had once made, and that alone made him a symbol of the deepest dignity, loyalty, and enduring humanity. This story is not just about war or heroes, it is about us. About how everyone has a promise to keep, a memory to honor, a person to never leave behind. If you see yourself somewhere in this story as a father, a friend, or simply as someone who keeps their word, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, or name the person you once promised never to forget. And if you believe such values are still worth preserving, hit subscribe and share this video with someone you know will understand. Because sometimes, what is right doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be carried forward, quietly but enduringly. He's not saluting the flag? The harsh voice cut through the drill field at Fort Carson, where hundreds of SEAL soldiers were raising their hands in salute to the half-mast flag. Everyone turned and they saw an old gray-haired janitor standing tall, unmoving, his hand not raised in ritual. Captain Ethan Rourke strode forward, his hand lifted, ready to grab the man's shirt in front of the entire unit. But in that very instant, Frank's calloused hand brushed the flag's rope, and the whole field fell utterly silent. Was it defiance, or was it a salute that echoed louder than any ritual? At dawn, when the mist still clung to the blades of grass and the wooden rooster in the base had yet to crow, Frank Mercer was already at Fort Carson. A small gray bus dropped him off at the gate, then rolled away, leaving behind a hushed emptiness. In his hand was an old wooden broom, its bristles frayed, and a faded baseball cap shading half his graying hair. He didn't head straight to the mess hall like the young soldiers, nor did he walk toward the supply depot. His first steps always led to the wide courtyard where the American flag stood tall on a steel pole. The same slow gait, slightly bent but steady, as if every step was measured by a memory long past. Frank stopped at the base of the pole, set the broom aside, and began his familiar task, checking each rope line, adjusting the little iron hook that clinked in the wind, and wiping away the thin layer of dust from the cement base with his sleeve. No one had ever assigned him this duty. No one even noticed. Yet he did it every morning, with the patience of a jeweler, as if that flag was bound to his own flesh and blood. When the reveille trumpet sounded, soldiers poured out of the barracks. They saw the familiar sight, an old man with a broom standing beneath the flagpole, his small frame swallowed by the wide sky. The young recruits snickered, one tossing out a mocking remark. That old man must think he's some kind of sentry. But then, as the flag rose, a few sharp eyes caught something. Frank had never once turned away. He stood firm, gaze fixed straight ahead, neither raising his hand in salute nor bowing his head. Just a quiet stillness, a salute not found in any manual, yet carrying an uncanny weight. Amid the bustle of the base, that habit was often overlooked. People only remembered him as the old floor sweeper, a shadow gliding silently through the corridors. But that small ritual, dusting the flag's base, keeping the ropes untangled, adjusting each hook gradually became its own ceremony. As if he were guarding something sacred the others had long forgotten. One morning, wind swept down from the Rocky Mountains, dragging fog into the compound. The flag swayed hard, the ropes clattering. A young soldier panicked, fumbling. Before he could react, Frank stepped forward, his sinewed hands steadying the ropes, calm as someone who had done it thousands of times. The wind eased, and the flag billowed free again. The soldier stared, ready to thank him, but Frank only picked up his broom and walked away without a word. Slowly, the glances that followed him each morning no longer carried just laughter. They held curiosity. Why did an old janitor tend to the flag more carefully than the young soldiers themselves? Why did he stand so rigid, eyes never straying, as if within that silence a hymn played only he could hear? Rumors began to spread. Maybe he was a veteran. Maybe he had lost someone beneath that flag. But no one dared ask. Frank never told, never encouraged their curiosity. He kept the truth locked in his calloused hands and in the footsteps that paused beneath the flag each dawn. Perhaps, behind that quiet figure, Frank was preserving a ritual of his own that no one at the base had yet understood. And if one day that silence were challenged, what would happen then? And before we continue with the main story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know. The cannons thundered. The ground shuddered as if it would tear itself apart. Black smoke and the stench of gunpowder choked K-San Base in 1968. In that storm of artillery fire, Frank Mercer, barely in his 20s, his face still young but his eyes already older than his years, stood as a Marine platoon leader, carrying the weight of 15 lives in one of the war's fiercest battles. For 77 days and nights, enemy shells rained without pause. Bunkers collapsed, trenches flattened, young Marines gripped their rifles with trembling hands. And in the midst of that chaos, one thing could never be allowed to fall: the American flag planted on the red dirt hill. It was more than fabric and thread. It was the fragile symbol that held together the spirit of men trapped on the edge. Frank knew this. Once, when the bombardment shredded their defenses and scattered his men, he raced up the hillside and saw the flagpole tipping, the flag about to crash. In that instant, Frank didn't think. He lunged forward, bloodied hands clutching the rope, forcing the pole upright through fire and smoke. Shells screamed overhead, earth and stone exploded around him, yet Frank stood, fists locked as if welding his very life to that flag. Below, the young Marine saw it a lone figure, small against the inferno, standing firm, holding the red, white, and blue aloft in the storm. And something strange happened. Their fear broke. M16 second lifted once more, eyes blurred with dust ignited again with fire. As long as the flag stood, the platoon stood. But the price was heavy. Many of Frank's closest friends fell and never returned home. On the final night of the siege, he sat in a ravaged trench, hands still gripping a rope slick with blood, while the groans of the wounded grew fewer. He knew not everyone would live to see that flag lowered with honor. In the years that followed, Frank rarely spoke of Quezon, but he carried it in every gesture. The way he stood beneath the flagpole at Fort Carson motionless, without salute, was that memory reborn. For Frank, saluting was no longer about raising a hand to his brow. It was a vow to those who had stayed behind. The flag would never fall again. Every night, in his shabby rented room near the base, he opened an old wooden box under the bed. Inside lay a scorched fragment of cloth, folded with care, the last piece of the Quezon flag he had held until the very end. He never hung it, never showed it off. He kept it beside a faded unit photo, where the eyes of his brothers were forever fixed at 20. And that is why, when the trumpet sounds at Fort Carson, Frank never raises his hand. He stands tall, eyes fixed on the flag, still as stone. In that silence, he hears the cannons of old, sees the final smiles of his comrades. He does not salute because he is the sentinel. If that past truly lived, then the silence beneath the half-mast flag today is no disrespect. It is Frank's way of keeping watch for the souls who fell. But the question lingers, will anyone on this base see the meaning in his silence before it is too late? The noon sun poured down on the drill yard, glinting along the steel corridors. The pounding of boots echoed in rhythm, mingling with sharp, commanding shouts. From a distance, Captain Ethan Rourke stepped out broad-shouldered, his crisp uniform gleaming, insignia on his lapels catching the light as if to swallow it whole. He walked with the familiar confidence of a man who knew he was respected or at the very least, feared. Ethan was the picture of a model officer, hard muscle, a long record of training achievements, a service file heavy with medals and commendations. In the barracks, his name was tied to brutal drills and clipped orders that no one dared to resist. He was used to absolute obedience. Used to the moment he appeared, every eye locking on him, every hand snapping to salute. But that morning, Ethan's gaze landed on something unusual. Beneath the flagpole, the old janitor with his faded broom stood tall, unmoving. Frank Mercer did not salute, nor did he turn away like the others. He simply stood silent, eyes fixed on the half-mast flag drifting in the breeze. To Ethan, the sight felt like a slap to discipline. In his eyes, it wasn't reverence, it was open defiance. A janitor, a man outside the chain of command, daring to stand equal in the face of a ritual the U.S. Navy held sacred. The young soldiers noticed instantly. One nudged his buddy, stifling a laugh. The mood spread like dry straw catching fire. The old floor sweeper wasn't saluting the flag. To the green recruits, it was both ridiculous and worth watching. They waited, as if for a spectacle, expecting the young SEAL captain to teach the old man a sharp lesson in discipline. Ethan stepped forward, his boots hammering on the concrete, his shadow stretching long across the ground, nearly swallowing Frank's lean frame. In that instant, The old man's silence was no longer just a personal choice. It had become a counterweight, a pause that tightened the air like a string ready to snap. Frank did not move. He offered no words, no explanation, no defense. His calloused hand rested lightly on the broom, his weary eyes never leaving the flag at half-mast. To him, this was no ritual of show, it was a vow signed in blood at Quezon. But to Ethan, that silence was an insult, a refusal to accept his authority. The young soldiers' hearts beat faster. Some swallowed hard, caught between fear and anticipation. They imagined the old man being dragged off, reprimanded, maybe even thrown out of the base. They imagined the captain's fist, the bark of his orders, the humiliation of someone who dared to stand level with a SEAL officer. But there are truths that cannot be measured in rank or medals. Lessons not taught in manuals, never spoken in training halls. They are carved by loss, by the roar of artillery, by the blood of fallen brothers, and Frank carried those truths in every breath. Ethan, with all the arrogance and glow of youth, had never understood them. All right then, my dear audience, if you're watching and finding this story compelling, drop a comment with the number 1 or write "I'm still here" to keep listening. The noise of the drill yard suddenly sank, as if the whole space were holding its breath. The sharp cadence of Ethan Rourke's boots echoed with each step, and with each strike the rows of soldiers stiffened even more. All eyes locked on a single point, the tall, youthful figure of the SEAL captain, radiating authority, striding straight toward an old, wiry man clutching nothing more than a worn broom. At the moment Ethan's hand rose, the air grew so heavy that even a breath could be heard. His arm angled downward, ready to seize Frank's shirt and drag him away like someone branded disrespectful. But then, unexpectedly, Frank moved. Not fast, not forceful, just a weathered, calloused hand resting gently on the flag's rope. The yard froze. That motion wasn't defiance nor resistance. It felt like a ritual, a reminder that this ground held more than iron discipline. It held memories carved in blood. Frank never turned. He stood tall, shoulders firm, eyes fixed on the flag sagging heavy against the gray sky. No wasted motion, not even a blink. In that moment, he was no longer a janitor, no longer the old floor sweeper. He became the living silhouette of a soldier who once endured the artillery storms of Quezon, holding the flag until his last brothers fell. Ethan faltered. His hand hovered in the air, unable to strike, unable to retreat. The arrogance that usually cloaked him fractured in the face of the silent stillness of a man who had survived war. Just a few seconds, but enough to erase the chuckles of the young soldiers. Even the wind seemed to still, letting the flag drift slowly in absolute silence. Some of the recruits' eyes shifted. They looked at that aged hand gripping the rope as though it held something greater than life itself. A truth surfaced. Perhaps the man hadn't forgotten to salute. Perhaps he was saluting in his own way. A salute that required no raised hand, because he himself was the symbol the others saluted toward. The yard was no longer a stage for mockery. It had become a lesson none had expected, a lesson no SEAL manual had ever written. Ethan still stood, his hands suspended, trapped in the heavy silence. For the first time, in the eyes of a few soldiers, the young captain was not the most revered figure on the field. Frank spoke no word. He didn't need to. His silence carried farther than any command, heavier than any shouted order. It was the silence of a man who had buried his friends beneath this flag, who had once clutched its rope with bleeding hands, and who still held it now not for himself but for the souls who had fallen. So who, truly, was saluting the flag, the young officer raising his hand by the book, or the old man standing silent, unmoving, a living monument? The noon sun tilted westward, casting a pale gold across the drill yard now wrapped in an uncanny silence. On the second-floor balcony of the command building, a young instructor absent-mindedly raised his camera. He had meant to capture a few training shots, but through his lens came something rare. Frank Mercer standing tall beneath the half-mast flag, his weathered hand gripping the rope, while behind him Captain Ethan Rourke froze, his arms suspended midair. The entire unit was still no laughter, no boots striking the ground. Click. The soft sound of the shutter rang out, as if it too understood it had captured something unrepeatable. That afternoon, the photo appeared on the base's internal system. At first, only a few glanced at it, but within hours, it spread through every break room, onto every laptop screen. Short captions traveling with it made the image heavier still. A man who does not need to salute because he is the symbol we salute. The young soldiers passed the picture around like a talisman. Some saved it as their phone wallpaper, others printed small copies to tuck into their lockers. They no longer looked at Frank as the old janitor. He had become a living memory, a silent witness of history, standing right in the middle of what they thought was ordinary life. One recruit laughed, half joking. If this were a movie, he'd be that mysterious figure stepping out of the past. But the laughter quickly faded into reverence as they realized the truth. Symbols did not come from rank, nor from polished metals. They came from the way a man stood tall, unmoving, in the moment when everyone else hesitated. Even in the mess hall, the atmosphere shifted. People grew quiet when Frank entered, not out of fear, but respect. One young soldier awkwardly slipped an extra donut onto his tray, mumbling an excuse about having extras. Frank said nothing, only nodded, his eyes carrying the faintest glimmer of a smile. For Ethan, however, the photo was a thorn. He saw it on bulletin boards, on the phones of his subordinates, even printed as a small poster in the gym. Each time his eyes landed on it, he saw himself locked in that moment of paralysis, facing down a wiry old man who stood taller than his pride. Each time, his chest burned as though someone were driving a blade into his ego. The image had become a mirror, reflecting two stark contrasts. A young officer, arrogant yet halted, and an old veteran, silent yet unshakable. The base began to buzz with talk. Some called Frank the flag keeper. Others whispered he might once have been a legend lost to time. And then the question crept into morning coffee chats, into corners of the barracks. How many other janitors like this have we overlooked? But if one photograph was enough to change the way an entire base saw him, what would happen when the truth about Frank finally came to light? The steady tapping of keys echoed in the small office of a veterans newspaper in Virginia. The journalist himself, once a Marine, paused for a long moment as he stared at the image spreading from Fort Carson. The photo of an old man standing rigid beneath a half-mast flag, hand gripping the rope, with a young SEAL captain frozen behind him. It awakened memories buried for more than half a century. That very night, the article was published under a simple headline: "That silence once saved an entire unit." Within hours, dozens of veteran outlets across America shared it. Conversations turned back to Khe Sanh, the brutal siege of 1968, where a young platoon leader had stood firm for 77 days under relentless bombardment, holding the flagpole upright while shells rained down. The article gave no name, but the photograph itself was proof enough. Frank Mercer was not just a janitor at Fort Carson. He was the living continuation of that symbol. Letters began pouring into the base. From Maine to California, veterans sent shaky but powerful words. One wrote, "He doesn't need to salute the flag, because we are all saluting him." Another added, "Honor is not in the ritual but in those who held it with their blood." Some even enclosed old photos. Youthful faces in trenches, tattered flags still raised through the fire and smoke. Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted day by day. The young soldiers who once chuckled now fell silent when Frank passed. Some quietly slipped an extra breakfast onto his tray, pretending it was leftover. Others lingered longer by the flagpole, as if trying to understand something from his unmoving stance. The glances cast toward Frank now carried respect mingled with awe. For Rourke, the change was a wound to his pride. He no longer heard the snickers at the mention of the old floor sweeper. Instead, he saw the photo pinned in break rooms, read the lines from the newspapers pasted on bulletin boards. And worse, he realized he had become the background figure in a story larger than himself. A lesson no training course had ever taught him. Some men need no authority to command respect. Meanwhile, in his worn-out rented room, Frank lived quietly as always. He didn't read the papers, didn't answer the letters. He simply carried on mopping floors, brewing coffee, checking the flag each morning. But he knew his silence no longer belonged to him alone. It had become a mirror for others to see themselves in. That afternoon, the late sun spilled through the Rockies, stretching long golden bands across the drill yard. Normally by this hour the soldiers had dispersed, leaving only the faint whistle of wind threading through the flags above the barracks. But today was different. More than 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the same figure, silent as if the yard itself had become an open-air chapel. Frank Mercer appeared again, his frame slightly stooped, worn shoes scraping softly on the concrete. He carried no broom, no clipboard. Only his calloused hand gripped the familiar rope at the flagpole. No one ordered him, no one assigned the duty. Yet with every dusk Frank came to straighten the lines, wipe the steel, make sure the flag never sagged carelessly. Tonight, the flag hung heavy at half-mast. Its darkened cloth caught the dimming light like a shroud of memory. Frank stood tall, hand on the rope, eyes locked upward, motionless. The entire yard, almost unconsciously, snapped to attention. No command barked, no voice shouted, "Attention." Yet shoulders straightened, feet aligned, as though drawn by an invisible order. They did not raise their hands to salute. Their eyes became the salute gazing at the old veteran's back, at the sinewy hand clutching the rope as if holding the very soul of battles long past. Frank bowed his head just slightly, but the gesture weighed down the air. He turned, walking away slowly, his figure swallowed by the fading light. Behind him, dozens of young soldiers stayed frozen in place, at attention, until his shadow vanished completely. In their minds, he was no longer the old janitor. In Frank, they saw a living monument, built not from stone but from resolve. A few covertly lifted their phones, capturing the moment. By evening, a second photograph joined the first on the base network. This time, it needed no long caption. A soldier wrote only, "This is how a man salutes the flag." The short message spread quickly, followed by comments, memories, comparisons. New names rose around Frank, the flag keeper, the silent soldier, the shape of honor. Rourke saw it too, though he tried to avoid it. From his office window, he watched his unit standing motionless at sunset, all because of the posture of an old man. In that fleeting moment, he understood. This was no longer about one day, one photo, or one ritual. It was a truth he could not undo, that honor can rise above rank, and authority can fracture beneath the weight of silence. Frank, meanwhile, remained unchanged. In his small rented room at the edge of town, he brewed his weak coffee, laid his faded jacket across a chair, and opened the old wooden drawer to glance at a tarnished medal. He had never sought to be a symbol, but deep down he knew his silence had become a spark, a flame that could spread beyond Fort Carson, beyond the walls of any base. And the evening wind carried the lingering question, would Frank Mercer continue to mop floors in quiet obscurity, or would the day come when he must step out of the shadows not to claim fame, but to safeguard honor for many more? That night, Frank left the drill yard as he always had. Yet he did not know that his upright stance had planted a seed of change in the hearts of dozens of young soldiers. To them, his silence was not defiance, but a ritual deeper than any oath. Frank's story reminds us that honor does not rust with the years, and respect does not come from rank or ritual, but from character forged in fire and time. Sometimes, the greatest salute is not a shouted command, but the steady, unmoving stance beneath a flag at half-mast. But this is not the end. A question still lingers. Can Frank remain hidden in silence, or will there come a day when he must step out of the shadows, becoming a public symbol for an entire generation? And if that day comes, how will he face the weight of attention from both the military and the community watching his every step? The answer will unfold in part 2, where Frank's silence may transform into a voice strong enough to shake an entire system. If this story has touched you, share it with your family and friends across America so they too can feel the power of silence and honor. Leave us a comment below. What do you believe is the loudest salute ritual or living true to an oath? And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we know you want to walk with Frank into the next chapter of his journey. To everyone watching from across the United States, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because our connection today can turn silent stories into a shared source of strength.